to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. A week ago, Syrian Sunni rebels under the banner of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, launched a surprise attack on the government forces of President Bashar al-Assad, capturing over the last week most of the strategic provinces of Aleppo and Idlib, which had been at the heart of the ISIS insurgency during the early years of the Syrian Civil War. The timing is auspicious. Assad's key allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, have been seriously distracted and/or weakened over the past year with their own conflicts. Most specifically, Hezbollah had just signed a ceasefire with Israel days before the HTS attack and is spending much of its energy right now focused on its remaining elements and the political situation inside Lebanon. Russia has been assisting Assad with airstrikes over the last few days, but it too has limited resources due to its own war over the last 2.5 years in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the role of Turkey, whether direct or pulling strings, has also raised eyebrows. It is a NATO member, after all, and while the U.S. has no love lost for Assad, Ankara's support for al-Qaeda-linked terrorists would be unhelpful to Washington. Or would it? Here to walk us through this web of interest is Professor Joshua Landis. Landis is head of the Center for Middle East Studies and director of the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and is a recognized expert on Syria politics and war. He also edits and manages Syria Comment, and his forthcoming book, Syria at Independence, Nationalism, Leadership, and Failure of Republicanism, will be published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies this coming year. So Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kelly.
It's great to see you. So first off, what can you tell us about HTS and Turkey's role in the current situation? What about the timing? Israel has been bombing Syria quite regularly since October 7th and is engaged in a long-standing dispute over the ownership of the Golan Heights. Seeing Assad losing territory and backed into a corner is no doubt a benefit to Tel Aviv. But then again, I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning that they were quite surprised by the current events and a little concerned about Islamic terrorists retaking all of these territories. So is Israel behind any of this? Are they as surprised as anyone else? What can you tell us about those dynamics?
Well, this has gone very quickly. And just last night, as I followed my events in Syria, Hama, the fourth largest city in Syria, has been penetrated by rebels who seem to have taken over the city of Hama, and the Syrian army has fallen back towards Homs. So that's there are four major cities in Syria: Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus. And the rebels are charging down the main highway and now have taken two of Syria's four largest cities. They seem to be on a roll. A friend just told me last night that Turkey and the rebel groups have put up 4 telephone towers around Aleppo, and they've already restored telephone service, and they have a new service called Syria Phone. The government service is Syria Tel, and now they're putting up a competing service. And this must be Turkish engineers that are doing this all. But it shows an incredible amount of preparation and forethought and planning, because this is all in the first week. So things are moving very quickly. As you said in your intro, I think very nicely, Israel has had a big role in this. Not that they planned it or they thought about this, but by destroying Assad's allies and really destroying the axis of resistance that had supported Assad. He is all alone and his army is exhausted. Hezbollah has been largely destroyed. Iran has had its ears pinned back and badly hurt. But mostly, it's the constant bombing of Syrian military centers over the last year, since October 7th. About 3 times a week, Israel has been bombing in Syria. Airports, it killed all the top Iranian generals in April, and then has been picking off more since. So that liaison has become very weak, and people are fearful of being there, but also manufacturing sites and it's landed paratroopers in there to take out computers and so forth to find out where Syria is manufacturing arms and destroying those centers. So the Syrian army has been greatly weakened, and it doesn't have its allies. And we saw the United States just recently shot up a convoy of Iraqi soldiers that were coming to help Assad. But as they moved across the border near the American zone and the Kurdish zone, A-10s strafed these trucks. We believe. We don't really know. America is keeping their cards very close to their chest.
Yes.
But we saw photos of the A-10s shooting just as these Iraqis were coming across. So America's playing a role too, not a big role. I don't think many people foresaw that the Syrian army would collapse at this rate, perhaps not even Turkey. But we're seeing a very well-oiled rebel force that has uniforms, night vision goggles, walkie-talkies. They are very well equipped, much better equipped than the Syrian army. And they've been training, and they look well fed. And they're rolling over the Syrian military, which is falling back from one city to the next and seems to be in complete, in disrepair. And Syrians just don't want to fight for this regime. And that's, I think, the most important factor is that the base, the Alawite base and the minoritarian base for this regime, as well as, many Sunnis who've remained loyal, just don't have much fight left in them. And they don't believe in this regime. They don't believe that it can produce a better future. And that's where American sanctions have played a big role, because most Syrians, after they came out of the civil war and it became a frozen fight 4 years ago, thought that there would be some kind of a peace dividend, that the economy would grow again, jobs would come back, and electricity restored, all those government services, and nothing like that has happened. In fact, the Syrian economy has continued to shrink year after year, and most young Syrians see no hope of the future under this Assad regime, and that's taken the fight right out of them. So that's the context for this, what seems to be a very rapidly moving battlefield.
Now, you mentioned that these rebel fighters are well equipped and well fed and organized. Can you talk a little bit about the Turkish role here? Because I feel like when this all broke, there was some confusion. The Turks had said they were as surprised as anybody else that this was happening. Others had said that the Turks had to be behind it because this seemed so well coordinated and efficient, and they were able to do things that just took everybody by surprise and could only have like a serious backer like Turkey. Can you talk about Turkey's role here and what your gut is on how deeply involved they are and what they're doing right now in terms of the Syrian Defense Forces and their fight on that end?
Sure.
Maybe just some context there.
Turkey is very involved. It's very clear that this is all happening because of Turkish backing. Now, there may be a lot of Qatari money going around as well, just as there had been with Hamas. We don't know who and how much help is coming from which nations, but it's very clear that there is a very well-greased propaganda campaign coming out here. And as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jolani have really made a pivot in their messaging, they've been very savvy in trying to reassure Christians, in particular Syrian Christians, of which there are a lot in Aleppo, that they're going to be totally safe and that they should trust this new regime, that they've gotten rid of their al-Qaeda-like international jihadist aspect, and that they're really nationalists today. That's the message that they're shooting out, and they're saying, trust us, we're going to be better for you than Assad, and we're going to take care of you. And they've done photo shoots in front of Christmas trees in Aleppo and so forth. And this is, this has taken a lot of forethought, coordination, and they've got good media teams. Now, this would not happen without an extraordinary amount of foreign backing and advice, counsel, and so forth. The money is tremendous. Getting up all these telephone poles. Idlib in northern Aleppo there's about 4.5 million people, mostly refugees, lots of people living in tent cities. There's no money, there's no manufacturing. None of this could happen without serious backing from very well-developed countries such as Turkey and Qatar, perhaps. And we don't know the level of Western backing yet. That's something that'll come out. Clearly, British intelligence, we know, has been working closely with various rebel groups on the messaging and so forth, but there's probably a lot of other intelligence agencies involved in this as well. We just don't know the level or the extent. And but it's a well-coordinated effort, and there are a lot of people who are working internationally to try to give Jolani this new look and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. You see op-eds in all of the papers, and people are putting their shoulders to the wheel and saying, this is a new group. It's trustworthy. America has no other choice but to go along with this. Assad's a failure. And that's a powerful message because this war has been going on for now 14 years, 13 years, and people are exhausted.
It's a powerful message, but it's hard for me to believe that it just sprang out into existence over the last week.
It did not spring out over the last week. You're absolutely right. And you know, the last years of civil war, a decade and plus, have been a dress rehearsal for this. And many different agencies have been involved in that and supporting the rebels over, since the beginning. There are many think tanks that are involved in that, certainly in the United States. And these op-eds are coming out of those think tanks. So this is not, this didn't just come up yesterday. This has been being planned for a long time.
When you say think tanks, can you name one or two? Because I was not aware of some of these op-eds. So I'm trying to keep on abreast of all of the developments here, but anyone that you could particularly name?
Well, New Lines Institute, there are many Syrianists. There didn't used to be any Syrianists in Washington, D.C. The only Syrianist, the first one, was Andrew Tabler, who was hired by WINEP, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which has a very deep and abiding interest in what goes on in Syria, being a sort of pro-Israeli think tank. But that was the only one. Today, there are Syrianists at almost every think tank because Syria became a very important issue. It has a great weight on our allies, both Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So there's money in it to have a Syrianist now in Washington. And it's of interest to the CIA and all the various agencies that are interested in what's going to happen in Syria. So Washington, in the last decade, since the Syrian Civil War, has gained a tremendous amount of expertise on Syria. And the Gulf countries are pouring money into these think tanks, as well as pro-Israeli Americans who want to address this issue. So everybody has gotten on board one way or another, and that's what I mean is that this has been an issue that's been burning now for 13 years since the Civil War started in 2011, and so that's why the gears are turning on the Washington side. But there is a concerted effort to rebrand Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and al-Jolani. Just 2 days ago, just recently, he put out stories, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham put out stories that it was going to dissolve itself. And in order to fit the Syrian people. And even Jolani is trying to get rid of his name, al-Jolani, which is a nom de guerre that ties him to his past with ISIS and al-Qaeda, and take on Shar, his family name that he started out with, so that he would be, have a regular name that didn't have all this, the nom de guerre stuff that we saw coming out of ISIS and al-Qaeda. So there is a major rebranding effort. And that may go a lot deeper than the propaganda, but we just don't know. And that's the real issue here, is how different will this really be? Is this just a charm campaign? Of course, Syria's minorities, and as well as many upper class Sunnis and secular Sunnis, are very worried about having an Islamist regime that will remind people a little bit of the Taliban or Hamas ruling over Syria, with all of its different people who are going to feel very alienated and by this kind of Islamic government with Sharia law and so forth. And no matter how much there has been a change of heart amongst the top leadership, many of its rank and file will not have changed that much. And we see glimmers of that. We've seen a few beheading videos come out. We've seen videos of soldiers smashing Christmas trees or destroying the liquor stores in Aleppo. Now, of course, that's bound to happen in any war, that your soldiers are going to do what they want to do, and they're not going to follow the central state, and this is the chaos of war. But it's very unsettling to many Syrians.
Yeah, especially for the people who actually live there, have to deal with it.
Especially for the people who live there. And there's been a lot of threatening videos about beheadings and so forth like that. And we've seen, many captured Shiites and so forth who are not soldiers being threatened with to have their heads chopped off and stuff like that. We haven't seen videos. We've only seen one video of a head chopping so far. I have. So it's limited, but it raises the question of, will this, many people think of the Taliban, where they said they were going to be better to women, that they changed their spots. And then, of course, as soon as they consolidated power, they banned education for women till sixth grade, from sixth grade afterwards. And now nobody expects the Syrians to ban women from education. I think they're more enlightened than the Taliban when it comes to women, but still they have a rather strict regime on education and so forth. There's not a lot of mixing of the sexes, and women wear very conservative clothing and so forth.
So just to get back, this coordination aspect, this charm offensive aspect, it worries me, because every time the West and their partners have gotten involved and meddling and creating these coordinated shifts in public opinion, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, it always seems to backfire on us and the rest of the world. So that troubles me. But just going back even further, with this amount of coordination, and given that the Israelis have a renowned intelligence capacity, as well as the UK and the US, do you think that the U.S. and Israel were alerted to or had some knowledge of what happened last week, the initial HTS attacks on Aleppo? Do you feel like, how far does that coordination go, or was it just the fact that they knew this was coming? Or maybe not.
No, that I don't know.
They were surprised.
I have no, Kelly, I just have no real insight into that.
Yeah.
I think, many people have speculated that Turkey did not realize that the Syrian army would melt away, and neither did the rebels. They thought they were going to take a big hunk of the highway between Aleppo and Damascus, and they were going to push out Idlib province and take a bunch of villages, but they didn't realize they'd be able to break into Aleppo and that the Syrian army would run away. And it's very possible. On the other hand, it's quite clear that they've been training for a major push for a long time. How that was going to be executed, when and where, it's also clear that they waited until there was a ceasefire in Lebanon and waited for Hezbollah to really be smashed. And I think that was the main trigger for this, is that the sense that Israel had really smashed Hezbollah, hit Iran hard. Iran was on its heels, and that there were going to be no reinforcements for Assad. And therefore, the field was open, and they went and found and began to punch holes in it. And once they realized that it was a paper tiger, they just kept on going. And that shows a great deal of organization and planning on their part to be able to move this quickly with this kind of numbers.
Just to talk about the United States role, you had mentioned briefly that the United States had engaged in military strikes. Just 2 days ago, Pentagon spokesman Pat Ryder had spoken to reporters about this. He said that the U.S. military had indeed engaged in strikes in northeastern Syria earlier in the week. He said to defend itself, meaning our troops there, from quote unquote imminent attack by Iranian militias. As you noted, the details are pretty scant. The DoD spokesman said this had nothing to do with the broader conflict going on, but Damascus had already accused at that point of U.S. forces of giving Syrian defense forces cover with airstrikes as they moved against Assad's forces. So can you talk a little bit about that? But also the Syrian defense forces are Kurdish, which are the Turks do not like. So what about the dynamics of the Kurds fighting for their piece of the territorial pie, and as this conflict roils, what role do they play? And also with the U.S., how far will the U.S. get involved, because it does have troops and interests in that part of Syria, and they have allied with the Syrian defense forces in the past. Like, this seems like a big mess just waiting to happen to me.
Yes, it does seem like a big mess. And it's confusing. We don't have good information at this point about who was killed by those F-10s. What we do know is that the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's the name given to these Kurdish-led U.S.-backed forces in northeastern Syria, took about 12 villages and a hunk of land that had been held by the regime. Now, America tried to cast that as just business as usual, that this is America helping the Syrian Democratic Forces against threats. Now, we don't know how many Iraqis, that would be the Iranian, they're always called Iranian-backed militias, right, but they're Iraqis. And Iran does back the government of Iraq. So they are Iranian-backed, as are all Syrian soldiers and I guess most of the Iraqi army. So we don't know who was killed in this and whether they were going to threaten Americans. That's a big question. If these Iraqis were coming off to kill Americans, then obviously America was going to defend its soldiers. But if they were going through to get to Assad and they were killed,
right,
then America is in the middle of this war and is clearly trying to help the rebels to win the war against Assad and has entered into the war in one way or another. And I don't know exactly what happened there. And I'd hate to go on record saying one thing and then find out that it's the other. But it seems like these two things happened at the same time. When Iraqis were coming across the border, there was reports of 300 Iraqi troops coming across the border in order to help Assad. And I don't know how many of them were killed, whether they were the main object of attack, or whether the Kurdish SDF was just trying to take a bunch of extra villages in case the regime falls and it doesn't want the rebels to have those villages. So I'm not positive of what role America has played, and we're not getting a good story out of it. It's very murky. But this is a very rapidly changing ballpark, and it raises the deeper question for America on the immediate scale of what America is going to want. Does it want a rebel-ruled Syria? And if it does, what relationship will that have to the Kurds? Because Turkey, one of its main objectives in taking over Syria and backing these rebels is to destroy the Kurdish militia that now rules northeastern Syria and is backed by the United States. So the United States is going to be forced sooner probably than later to choose between Turkey and its Kurdish enclave in northeastern Syria.
Well, to me, and to most Americans, like, you have to ask the question, like, what is this of America's interest? What you just said there, this very real conundrum of either backing our NATO ally in this fight to get rid of Assad, or stick with the Kurds, which is the enemy of the Turks. Most Americans are looking at that and going, what is it? What does this mean to me? What does this mean to my life here in the United States? You know, they don't even, the dynamics themselves are so complicated, much less discerning why this is a national security issue for us. And I think at the very minimum, I would ask, are our troops, the 900 troops that we have there, are they just sitting ducks? I mean, either they're sitting there and defending themselves, like you mentioned. They could have been defending themselves from these militias coming in from Iraq, or they've decided to enter the fight, which would make them even more further in harm's way, as far as I'm concerned. So this seems,
how do we think
seems like a real, yeah.
I think there's a major debate going on in Washington over how to see this and what are America's interests. And traditionally, over the last really about a decade, America pulled its support from the rebels. In about 2015, America was spooked by the rebels because they had become dominated by ISIS and al-Qaeda. And the head of the CIA, Brennan, in 2015, talked to the Council on Foreign Relations and said, we don't want Assad's government to fall at that point, because ISIS was going to sweep into Damascus. And the Times of Israel in March had a big headline saying, CIA head says Assad should stay. Now, that was putting some words in his mouth, but he had made that argument, essentially, that nobody, not Russia, not America, not the allies, not the Saudis, or the Israelis, wanted to see Assad fall at that time. And so America shifted its support from the Sunni Arab rebels to the Kurds, because the Kurds were willing to kill ISIS. And we have to remember that ISIS at this time was an important element of the Sunni Arab rebellion against Assad. And the rebels refused to fight ISIS because they said, no, we want to fight Assad. Assad is our main target, and anything that distracts us from that is bad. So America shifts horses from the Sunni Arab rebels to the Kurds. And it's been there ever since. And the argument that was made most clearly by James Jeffrey, Trump's previous special envoy to Syria, a longtime State Department official, he made the argument that, well, we can't defeat Assad, that was plan A, and get rid of him. So we have to go to plan B. And plan B is to turn Syria into a quagmire and to keep it extremely weak, not to allow Assad to rebuild, and in order to hurt Iran and Russia and help Israel. That was the major interest, as well as to police so that ISIS could not come back. But it's about helping our allies and hurting our enemies. And in that sense, we kept Syria divided into three. We kept control of the oil, as Trump said, we're going to get the oil. And that helps to defray the costs of this Kurdish militia that's policing this 1/3 of this 30% of Syria that America owns. And we've got very heavy sanctions. And we've been coordinating with Israel on how to bomb Assad's military to keep it weak. So that's been our strategy of keeping a weak Syria, hurting Iran and Russia by not letting Syria rebuild and not letting it become an asset in their hands. And this helps Israel. So, President Trump has talked about withdrawing American troops from Syria already. Just a few weeks ago, Robert Kennedy Jr. said that he'd had a conversation with Trump in which he said he wanted to pull troops out. But most of Trump's new lieutenants that he's appointing in his foreign policy elite have expressed the opposite and said that we need our troops in Syria because we need leverage. Number one, we need to have we've got a dog in the fight, and we want to have soldiers on the ground. We want to hurt Iran because they're Iran hawks by and large.
Right.
And they're very pro-Israel. So they want to help Israel by hurting Iran. And this gives, by having a rebel win, I think for many of that foreign policy elite, they see it as being able to flip Syria from being part of the Shiite crescent that the four major powers linking Hezbollah ruled in Lebanon, Assad Syria, Shiite Iraq, and Iran, all linked together, all Shiite dominated, and a common front against Israel. And Israel has just pounded that front with lots of American help and planning. And now there's a chance to destroy Assad and flip the regime, have Turkey-backed rebels in charge that are Sunni Arab. And this would sever the land routes of resupply to Hezbollah. And that would really destroy Hezbollah. And so I think that's going to be the dominant thinking in Washington. The trouble is, you're going to get an Islamist ruled Syria.
That's what I was going to say. It seems very short-sighted to me. And that Wall Street Journal article that I mentioned earlier that talked about how Israel was trying to keep this balance all along, to keep Assad weak, but not invite a radical Islamist takeover of Syria at the same time. Is this inviting that Islamist takeover? And what kind of threat would that pose to Israel? And then you have the Kurdish-Turkish element in the northwestern part of the country, or northeastern part. I mean, does that set up a situation in which the United States has to confront its own NATO ally if it wants to protect its Kurdish friends? It seems to me that, what you said in terms of like all this planning to beat back the Shia, the crescent, and put them in check is inviting a whole host of other problems on the other end.
It is inviting a host of other problems, and it's going to advance Islamism. And already, Sisi in Egypt has come out and said, we don't want to see Islamists take over. Of course, he's very worried about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Much will depend, I think, on how Israel and Saudi Arabia break on this and what they want to see in Damascus. United States has gotten into a fight that it doesn't really understand. And
big surprise.
Surprise, indeed. And we're in over our head. We've been in over our head ever since we invaded Iraq. And we've caused a lot of damage in the region and many dead lives and refugees and so forth. And I think that the best thing for America to do at this point is to stay out of the fight and really not to. It's going to be impossible for America, I think, to side with Assad against the rebels. And I don't know if America has the capacity to try to stop the rebel onslaught at this point. Obviously, it can talk to Turkey and Qatar and others, but it's a very dynamic battlefield, and American troops are far from the center of the battlefield right now. And the United States has spent the last decade and a half demonizing Assad and the Syrian army, and because it's been extraordinarily brutal civil war. And there are many Syrians who, of course, want Assad to fall, but there are many Syrians who don't, and fear for the future of Syria and for their own lives. And that's, it's a very scary moment for everybody in Syria. And boy, it's very hard to see a path forward for the United States at this point.
Yeah,
That's going to be constructive, where they're going to do the least amount of harm.
Well, I really appreciate all of your honesty and insights, and I can honestly say myself that this has been 20 or 34 minutes of the best analysis that I've heard on this issue all week. So I really appreciate it, and I know the listeners will too. We'll be presenting this tomorrow. This will be published Friday morning, so we hope that it won't need too much updating. But as you say, the events are fluid, and we shall see. And I hope you come back on the show someday to sort of give us some more context and insights into what America has been doing and what it's been fomenting in the region.
Well, Kelly, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure, as always, speaking to you with excellent questions.
Thank you, Josh.